Hi, this is my mom. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Mary Griska Sagan.
We're going to learn a little bit about her life in the 1960s. First, tell us a little bit about your life.
Well, I was born in 1956, so in 1960 I was just a toddler, and then I was a teenager by the end of the 60s. I grew up in Wintersville, Ohio, in a big family. I have 3 brothers, 3 sisters. My dad worked as a mailman, and my mom stayed at home to raise us.
Alright, one of the main events in the 1960s was the Vietnam War. Did you know anyone that was fighting in Vietnam?
There were several boys that grew up in our neighborhood that I knew that had gone to the war to fight, and one of them died over there. His name was Roy Haswell. I still remember that, and I remember going to the funeral and it being a really solemn occasion in our neighborhood. And the other part I remember was I have an older brother who was old enough to be drafted, but when he went to Columbus for his physical, he found out that he had punctured eardrums, so he wasn't eligible to go over and serve. So we were lucky that he didn't have to go. But I didn't really know anybody that I was close to that fought in the war.
Alright, now politically, what about the presidents? Were there any that were popular or unpopular? Do you remember any of them?
Well, like everybody else, even though I was young, I remember where I was the day that Kennedy died. I was home from school sick. I had got my tonsils out. My dad was off from work that day, and he was outside visiting with the neighbor across the street when the news came on the TV, and I remember my mother running out to get him and the neighbor, and they came in and they all watched it. And even though I didn't have like a real concept of what dying was, I knew something tragic had happened, and I remember my parents just not being able to drag themselves away from the TV. I also remember that at our house, my father was a Republican and my mother was a Democrat. And even though he was a Democrat, the idea that someone could assassinate the President of the United States was upsetting to him. The next president was Johnson, and then when Nixon came into office, my dad was thrilled because he was a Republican. And even up to and after the time when he was impeached and left office, he still was a Nixon supporter.
Okay, another significant part of this decade were several movements including civil rights, women's movements, and the anti-war movement. Do you remember anything about civil rights?
Well, I really don't. I think growing up in a town like Wintersville, where it wasn't such a big thing, segregation and stuff like that, I really don't remember that. I will have to say that I remember as a child, our garbage man was black. We didn't see a lot of black people in our neighborhood, but we always thought that he was somebody who we aspired to have his job. He was the nicest person. He would always talk to us, and we thought he was rich because he got to drive around in that big truck. So the idea of discriminating against somebody because they were black wasn't something that was supported in our neighborhood. But I do know that there were certain sections of Wintersville where you knew that that was where the black people lived. And it wasn't, you know, we didn't run from that place or something like that, but we just knew that that's where they lived. They did have different sections. And I remember in Steubenville that there was a swimming pool where black people went to swim, white people didn't go there. But it wasn't mandated by law. It was just something that the culture had settled upon.
Alright, what about women's rights? Were women still discriminated against, and were there things you weren't allowed to do?
Definitely, women were discriminated against. One of my favorite sayings is Title IX was a pipe dream when I was in high school. There was no such thing as women's sports when I was in school, in elementary school or in high school. We got to play intramural sports. We were interested in sports and we loved them, but there was no funding for us to have teams, and I know for myself it would have been something that I would have enjoyed, and it happened right after I graduated high school that Wintersville started to get different teams, like a track team and a basketball team and stuff like that. And I do feel that even today there is a discrimination against women in the workplace. Women do still take a back seat. It hasn't been a long enough time that they have been considered for jobs. I think, hopefully in your generation, all of that will be over with, and we'll just look at people and not at their race or their gender to decide if they're the person for the job.
Alright, how about anti-war? Did you ever hear anything about anti-war movements, like in the universities?
Well, because I have older brothers and sisters, I would hear them and their friends talk about it sometimes. None of them really went to university, but all of them fell to the draft. And so at that time, it was more important for them to be talking about whether or not they thought that war was a good idea, because they had no choice. They were drafted. If you were a boy and you were 18 in good health, you had to go to war. So at that time, all the boys that were 18 had a much stronger opinion about fighting and what the government was doing in Vietnam.
Alright, now a little bit about the culture. There was a counterculture of young people that formed in the 60s. Did you know any of these hippies?
Well, I'll say no. I can't really, like I said, having an older brother and sister that were probably in their late teens in the 60s, I don't think either of them was really what you would consider to be a hippie, and I don't really remember anybody that acted that way. So I'm going to have to answer no to that question.
Alright. Did you have a television set? And if so, what kind of TV did you watch?
Well, I'll tell you what kind of TV we watched. Black and white. We did have a TV. It was small, but it was black and white. And I think my favorite time to watch TV was on Saturday mornings. We would get up and watch cartoons, which were Mighty Mouse, Underdog, and then there were little half-hour dramas. There was My Friend Flicka, Black Beauty, The Lone Ranger, and there was a lot of Western shows. So I'll say I remember watching like Bonanza, and on Sunday nights, I think because you had to get up for school the next day, everybody was in the house, we would all sit down and watch Ed Sullivan. He was always on Sunday nights. That was a variety show, and we just loved it.
Alright, what about your favorite music to listen to?
Well, we had a stereo, and you put albums on the stereo. There was 10 songs on one side. On Saturday mornings, we all had to get up and clean house. We would put a stack of records on that stereo and just let them play while we cleaned. And we listened to everything. Our music, we had Beach Boys records, which my brother liked, a lot of Cars. There were songs about cars.